when I was there for the segment, and when we talked about a little bit, imposter syndrome and helping people get through that, and how it can
Sure.
actually be a good thing. So I was like, man, I think you'd be perfect for hopping on it and just kind of bringing people through your experience. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it
What?
was a long time ago, but the interesting thing is, it's still with me, and
Yeah.
I don't know if it's typical that you might think in a movie it would be like, oh yeah, I had imposter syndrome when I did this, but now 10 years later, I realize that was a mistake, and I
Right.
was cool there. But in fact, I still feel the same way. Like I really snuck through. I really snuck through, and they didn't discover me. So
Well, that's what I
like,
talked about on the news a little bit. So you would think it's just for emerging professionals or even college kids, but I've talked to people who have been in business for 20, 30, 40 years and they still feel it, whether it's because they're with a new company or like you just said, you feel like you snuck through and no one discovered it.
never, no one discovered me. So you want me
Yeah.
to go into the story real quick?
Yeah, let's talk about that. So coming out of Tulane and just kind of start there and feeling like top of the class, head of the class kind of guy, go to Colorado State, recognize or realize that there's a lot of different people from across the world there who you can kind of, see they've got great potential and, makes you feel a little bit maybe unnerved. But yeah, if you could just tell that story, I think that was really interesting.
So undergrad, I went to Tulane. My dad was a professor, a chemistry professor, so I kind of grew up around the university,
Right.
and I got to go to Tulane basically for free because back in those days, if a parent worked for the university, and this is for professors or uh, administrative, or even for somebody on the maintenance crew. If you were a plumber at Tulane, your kids could all go there tuition free, basically.
Wow.
So that was such a good deal, I couldn't pass it up. So I was a townie, good old fashioned townie, because I grew up around Tulane and I knew all the professors. And it was kind of a. So anyway, I went to Tulane. Long story short, had a couple of degrees. I got a degree in physics and a degree in French. And
Hmm.
Tulane's a pretty good school. It's pretty competitive.
Yeah.
Um, it's not MIT and it's not Stanford, but overall it's a pretty good private school in New
A great
Orleans.
reputation. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and it was. So I'm not saying, I don't want to give the impression that I was, that it was. How would I say it? But when I went through Tulane, I really, I wasn't challenged enough, I don't think, and that was bad for me. So I went through, basically got 2 degrees, pretty much straight A's, but I was a lazy student. I really didn't work as hard as I should have. And I think in retrospect, that became part of the problem, right? So I was, okay, I thought it was pretty hot stuff. I got a physics degree. They didn't have atmospheric science or meteorology at Tulane. So
Okay.
I thought, I'd like to stay and go into meteorology. I've always liked weather. So I started applying to graduate schools around the country that actually taught atmospheric science or meteorology, because Tulane did not. I thought, yeah, that'd be kind of fun to do this. Maybe I've always, even when I was a little kid, I liked weather. So I applied to 3 or 4 different graduate schools, really didn't know too much about it. And I got an offer for a research assistantship at Colorado State Atmospheric Science Graduate Department. It's only, in fact, the Atmospheric Science Department at Colorado State is only a graduate department. They don't even have an undergraduate
Wow.
program. And I knew it was okay. It had a good reputation. But when I showed up there, I realized quickly that even though I thought it was pretty hot stuff from going through Tulane with basically a 4.0 and 2 degrees, and it took me 5 years, but I got 2 degrees, that
Yeah.
I was at best an average student, and at worst a pretty poor student. And part of that, I think, was just the laziness that I had developed at Tulane. My first indication that I was in over my head was my first test exam there was in atmospheric thermodynamics.
Oof,
And,
sounds
and the
tough.
professor,
Yeah.
it was pretty hard. I got the worst score on an exam I have ever had in my life. And I give it my, the usual thing. I studied for half an hour. Hey, I'm good, no problem here.
All
When
good.
the next day, I'm like, oh my God, I don't know any of this stuff.
Yeah.
And I came back like a 45.
Mm.
Again, a huge shock, because I don't know if I'd ever flunked a test ever. And it was the worst score in an exam I'd ever gotten. And I think that was my first wake up call that, whoa, this is this is a whole different world here. So the thing with Colorado State is when I got there, everybody else there as well were all the best at
Top of the
their,
class. Yeah.
yeah. Like my friends were like, oh yeah, I was #1 at MIT. Oh my goodness. Oh yeah, I was #1 at Cornell, Virginia Tech, Rutgers. We had guys from other countries that had gotten scholarships to go to Colorado State, get a graduate degree, and go back and be administrators in their weather services in their
For
countries.
the whole country.
So I guess the only thing I could compare it to non-academically would be like if you were a pretty good athlete at your small town high school, like you were a pretty good quarterback on the hometown high school team in football, right?
Yeah.
And you got I got an offer, a partial scholarship to go to this place called University of Alabama. Yeah, I'll go down there. Not
Go check
knowing.
it out. Yeah.
You get on the field and you realize, man, everybody else is much better. So I got to Colorado State and it was just an eye opener for me. I discovered
that for you though, Brian. So you go through that process, you get that 45. Was that, I mean, no, it turned out positive for you because you're renowned now as kind of as an expert, but was that good for you kind of looking back?
It was very good. And the first thing I did is the next day I went into my professor, who I love. He was a great guy. He was one of the smartest human beings you will ever meet. And I mean that literally. I'm not just saying that like as a compliment. Yeah. He's like, well, he always simplified everything, and he could explain anything to anybody in a very simple manner without being condescending. He was very good at that. So he said, well, Ron, I've seen this a lot of times. Don't feel bad. This is very common. Probably at Tulane, you were never challenged enough and you didn't study enough. This is a new place here. This is going to be harder. You're probably an average student here, and you're going to have to work a little harder, basically is what he said. And it was true. And he helped me. And when I had questions, I would go in and ask him about even subjects that weren't his specialty. Right. So I guess, I got through it. And about 3 years later, I got my degree and escaped. And I thought, man, but almost every day I thought, and maybe this is common for imposter syndrome, I had had this feeling that two big guys I would be in the office, like working on my research, and two big guys would come in. One would be on either side of me, pick me up and kick me out the front door and say, you're not smart enough to be here.
Oh man,
we're physically kicking you out. And even after I got my degree, I was like, man, I snuck that through. They never did discover how stupid I really was. And I kind of let that, after about 30 years of doing the weather here. Yeah. A few years ago, my professor finally retired. Now, when I had gone to Colorado State, my major professor, my research professor, really nice guy. He was very young. He was only a few years older than I was. Really? So, but he retired a few years ago. So they had a big party for him. So I flew back to see, because I liked him so much. I actually flew back to Denver, drove up to Fort Collins. Cool. And I'm in the big, we had like a reception before the big, the speeches and everything. And there was this other guy there about my age, maybe a little bit younger. And I was describing to him who I was, what year I had gone there. And I'm like, yeah, you know what, though? I tell you what, I still feel like I snuck through. And that at any time I could have been discovered and thrown out for being too stupid. And he goes, my God, I had the same thing every day. Man, he's like, I always felt that I wasn't smart enough to be in this program. And at any point, they were going to discover that and just boot me out. And he is I forgot his name, but he's like a high level administrator with the National Weather Service, like in Washington now. So that's when I finally realized, you know what? This sounds like what I've heard about, something called imposter syndrome, where you think, I'm sneaking through here. Exactly. Hopefully nobody will discover that I really don't belong here. And for me, it turned out to be I think you already mentioned this. It turned out to be a good thing, right?
Mhm.
Because it really motivated me and it humbled me. And those were both things I really needed. Coming out of Tulane, I thought it was pretty hot crap,
Yeah.
um, because I did so well, but I wasn't. The competition just, you know what I mean? Does that make any
Oh, for
sense at
sure. It
all?
does. Yeah. Yeah. I
I can
think a
see
lot of
the
people
same
go
thing
through
again
that.
in athletics. If you're a
Yep.
pretty good athlete in a small town somewhere, thinking you were much better than you really were, and then all of a sudden you're on the big stage with people that are taller than you, faster than you, smarter than you, heavier than you, and you realize, man, I'm going to have to work my butt off just to stay and be average. And
The
so that's
average.
what
Yeah.
happened to me. And again, it was a very humbling experience, but very motivating. And I think that it really finally lit a fire under my butt, which was at the end of the day a good thing.
Well, I like what you said, Brian, about so when you recognize that that was happening, you went to someone in your network, right? You went to your professor, to your advisor. I think a lot of people kind of get stuck and maybe put their head down and just maybe hide a little bit like an imposter would do. What do you remember anything else specifically that you did? Because my whole thing is I think imposter syndrome can be a good thing if you harness it correctly because it can make you work harder, do more training, whatever it is. Do you remember anything else specifically that you did that helped you kind of get through that?
Man, I just worked my butt off
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah.
and I really talked to almost all the professors there, and I realized that I was going to have to work maybe a little harder than I thought because I
Yeah.
wasn't as smart as I thought. But yeah, my professor, my research professor, was one of the nicest, most down to earth guys ever, and I really, really trusted him, and that helped a lot.
Right.
So that may be the thing. If you're in a situation where there's somebody there you can trust, that is probably a really good thing.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. More generally speaking, just about careers, because we try to do, career happiness, career fulfillment, tips and tricks. And we kind of do these different networking events and things like that. How have you found career happiness? Obviously, you've been doing this for a long time, but how have you kind of stayed motivated to kind of get better and improve your craft?
Well, actually, maybe that helps because I was not to the point of having imposter syndrome on TV,
Hmm.
but I was never a really gifted speaker. And I realized, so I'm not a natural TV weather guy. I would be better as an academic or a forecaster. Um, so for me, it's always a little bit of a struggle to do TV weather.
Really?
It's
Still?
a challenge every day. That's right.
Wow.
So I remember when I got into TV, my parents are like, "No, you'll never make it. For one thing, you don't speak very well. You're not a good speaker. You
Mhm.
kind of stutter and you mumble a lot, and so I don't know if you're going to be very good at it." So and also, I'm not. I don't want to say. I guess I'm not the best looking guy ever that you're gonna see like I'm not gonna be a movie star or anything like that. So between not being a very gifted speaker and maybe not being the best looking guy ever, to me, every day when I do weather, it's a challenge.
Wow, no
Like,
kidding.
like even after 30 years, I still go in thinking, man, I'm gonna have to really try hard to do this well today. So I've never gotten to the point where I'm like lazy about it, if that makes any sense. So
Yeah,
every
yeah.
day, even after 35 years, every day is a brand new challenge for me.
Man, that's surprising to hear because you feel like you would eventually kind of get in that comfort zone, but that
Uh-uh.
probably helps you. Like you said, that's a good motivator.
Yeah, I've talked to other people that have the same thing on TV.
Really?
Every single day is a new challenge. So I would think if you did get in that comfort zone, that would be a bad
Be a
thing
bad thing,
because
yeah.
then you
I
would
bet you're right.
be, yeah, you'd probably be lazy. You wouldn't be sharp.
Interesting.
So, yeah, yeah.
So for people who feel stuck or feel maybe unhappy or bored or whatever in their careers, I mean, what is some advice you can give them? Because regardless of if you're comfortable or not, kind of what you're doing, you've done a great job. You've built a really good reputation, yeah, with your career. So what kind of tips would you give someone who's trying to get unstuck?
Yeah, have at least a couple of people that you really trust,
Yeah.
um, and talk to them. And I think you really have to like what you're doing. And I always have liked. The weird thing about me is I've always liked forecasting and I like weather. My my challenges in my career have always come from things like administrators, consultants, all those people that try to make your job as difficult as possible.
Sure. Oh
Does
yeah.
that make sense? You know, and I've had some news directors and some managers that have been great friends, but overall, they don't have the same goals that you do. Their
No, for
goals are
sure.
to maximize profit, get the best ratings ever, and your goal is to forecast the weather and be a good forecaster.
Yeah.
And those aren't exactly the same things all the time. So that's been a challenge for me. But yeah, just I love weather and I love forecasting, and I think that helps a lot. So every day is different. Every day is an adventure when I go in. All the information is new every day, every single day. And then, yeah, just the fact that it's always been a challenge for me, like we were saying. I'm not a naturally gifted speaker. I'm not the best looking guy in the world. So every single day I'm there, I'm like, wow, I'm going to have to really try today to
Hmm.
do a good job. Which is, after 35 years, when I'm actually thinking about retirement now, maybe when I retire, I can finally relax and say,
Take a deep breath. I made it through.
I made it through. That's right.
Well, what about your photography business? So, I mean, I think part of, staying happy with our careers, like our full-time gigs, is
Uh-huh.
having, like you said, some people around, but also having other things to focus on. Like it can't be all we think about. So you've got your photography, kind of, I wouldn't call it a hobby. Obviously, you have a freaking gallery downstairs, but how much
Yeah, it's
played
it's
into
it's
it?
it's somewhere between a hobby and a career, I guess.
Yeah.
I'm not going to make you don't as a landscape photographer, it's very difficult to make any money. I have a couple of friends that do, but they don't do it through selling their artwork. They do it through like leading photography tours,
Gotcha.
and they like live in Arizona and Colorado, right? So they're in
Mm.
in really high tourism areas. So that's how they make money through photography. I mean, they do sell a few prints. So around here, it's more of a labor of love.
Gotcha.
In fact, this weekend, I'm heading out west. I'm going to be on the Colorado River doing a photography float down the river through the Grand Canyon next week.
Very
So
cool.
it always keeps, that's another thing that keeps it fresh, keeps me motivated. I'm always trying. And I'm always thinking, maybe today will be the day that I'm discovered and I become famous and I get rich as a photographer.
Love
And
it.
strangely, it never happens, but I keep trying.
You got to keep shooting. Yeah, that's great.
That's right. That's right.
Well, one question, I think I sent it to you just ahead of time too, but we try to end these just by thinking about, what we wanted to be when we were kids. Everybody's kind of got that story. Maybe just sometimes some people tell me I have no idea. I wasn't thinking that way as a kid, and that's
Uh-huh.
fine too. But do you have anything like memories of, being 5, 6, 7 years old, what you wanted to be, and then what you would go back and tell that version of yourself if that was a possibility?
Yeah, in fact, I really did think about being a TV weatherman when I was
No
about 6 years
kidding.
old. It,
Awesome.
it was strange because I was always interested in weather, and I found that even as a little kid, I was more savvy about what was going on with the clouds and the atmosphere than
Yeah.
most of the people around me, even the adults. I remember there's this one memory. I was in first grade, I think. I was out front. I'm looking down the street at the sky, and this was in New Orleans where I was growing up. My dad was a professor. Remember, I'm like, that looks like a really bad thunderstorm and it's moving our way.
Hmm.
And I told my friend, I'm like, look how dark the sky is. He says, no, that's the blue sky. I'm like, no, that's not the blue
Didn't
sky.
see it.
The
Yeah.
sky is so dark. That's a thunderstorm. And he was a much older kid. So I realized, looking
Hmm.
back at those days, I'm like, I already had kind of a knack for weather. So yeah, even as a kid, I used to watch the weather on TV every day. I
Cool.
tracked hurricanes when I grew up in New Orleans as a little kid. And so it sounds really corny, but I really did think seriously that I would like to be a TV weatherman when I grew up.
Love
And
that.
so
Well,
there were
let it
times there were
happen.
detours. I remember thinking about being a forest ranger. What other thing? Everybody wants to be a fireman when they're a little kid, but eventually it all came back to weather and forecasting. So
Wow.
somehow it worked out.
Yeah, that's amazing. I love that. That's great. What else, Brian? Anything that you think I'm missing here? This has been great. I feel like the imposter syndrome thing is definitely top of mind for a lot of people. A lot of professionals talk about it, but anything else you want to, any other wisdom you want to
I
impart?
can't think of anything other than the fact that I don't know if you ever get over it. I mean, like say, I still expect one day Colorado State to like send me a registered letter in the mail saying, "Hey, we've looked back
Taking
and
it back.
we're taking our degree. Can you send us your degree because we don't think you actually were smart enough to get that degree?" But
Man, yeah, I
um,
wonder if that ever goes away. Yeah, that's an
yeah, I
interesting.
don't think it does. But again, it turned out to be a good thing because it was a challenge and it challenged me and it motivated motivated me a lot more than I would have been otherwise.
Interesting stuff. Well, man, thanks so much, Brian. This has been great. I hope you have a great time this weekend. Have a blast.
Yeah, good. Yeah, thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Brian.